You're listening to the Bail in the Midwest podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Several of our past episodes have been about so-called bail reform and some of the consequences of what we feel are misguided policy decisions. However, to be fair, most of our guests have a vested interest in this position as they have largely been involved in the bail bond industry. And we, as bondsmen, often view bail reform as just an attack on us and our profession specifically, rather than just one battle in the ongoing war against the criminal justice system writ large. Defund the police, decarceration, and the increase of progressive prosecutors are also attacks on what I feel is one of the pillars upon which our society rests. So today, we'll be talking with someone who's not directly involved in the bail bond industry and who can give us some perspective from other areas of the criminal justice system. Our guest today is Sergeant Betsy Smith. Betsy, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'll tell you, this is a huge topic of discussion around the nation when we talk about law enforcement reform, when we talk about criminal justice reform. It's a huge topic. I'm glad that you're taking it on.
Well, thank you. Normally what I do with our guests is here, I let them kind of give their CV rather than me going over that as far as their background is concerned. I've read yours, and I could probably spend, half the podcast just going over all the things you've accomplished. But if you'd like to kind of hit the highlights of what you've done in your history and maybe what you're doing now, kind of give us an idea what your background is on this.
Yeah, my whole bio would be really boring. Basically, I became a police officer in 1980 in a Midwestern city near Chicago. I was there for 29 years and worked a variety of assignments. I had still have a parallel career to all of that, where I write for various magazines, online publications like Officer.com, PoliceOne.com, Law Officer, and more. I'm still a current police trainer. My husband, Dave Smith, and I are traveling the country training police officers on a variety of topics. And currently, I am the spokesman for the National Police Association. And one of the things that we do is we tackle issues like quote unquote bail reform and its effect on not only law enforcement, but on the citizens that we are trying to protect.
Okay, well, let's get into current news. On Sunday, the New York Post published a story where a recently retired, and unfortunately, a lot of these stories come from recently retired police officers. Remember, the New York Police Department brass described bail reform as, quote, an atom bomb dropped on the criminal justice system that set the entire system back at least 10 years. And I get the feeling that this is a widely held belief within law enforcement, but how does changing one little thing cause the whole system to crash like it seems? I mean, is it just throwing sand in the gears, or is there, how is it changing this one little thing from the people who support this? How does that have such an outsized impact on the criminal justice system?
Well, what's happening is, and New York is a perfect example, but of course we can go beyond that to LA, my native Chicago, and beyond. In an effort to reform the criminal justice system, you have a few well-meaning folks who are saying, it's not fair that only poor people have to remain in jail until they go to trial or until a judge reduces their bail. They should have the opportunity to also get out. That's the story. What really ends up happening is that criminals end up with either zero bail or extremely low bail, and they basically beat the patrol officer who arrested them back to the neighborhood in the same shift that they've been arrested. And what this is causing is a rise in crime, and we can talk more about that. And B, from a law enforcement perspective, it is demoralizing hardworking cops who have already spent the last 2 years being vilified and being attacked and being lied about to the point and in that article that you talked about, where, for example, NYPD is just bleeding police officers. They have so many retirements, and not just retirements with a pension, but police officers are leaving New York City in droves without even a retirement. They're just getting out. They're either going somewhere that's more friendly to law enforcement and is more pro law enforcement as opposed to pro criminal, or they're getting out of the profession altogether.
I think there was a news article that I saw today, or at least somewhere in my Twitter feed, and also in New York Post, which seems to be the only paper that's aggressively covering this in New York, but that they quoted 2,000 police officers had left this year, without their pension. And my recollection, and this might be old, but I thought that the New York City Police Department had like 40,000 officers. And that could be off a little bit, but 2,000 officers is a significant percentage of your staff. That's a lot of institutional knowledge that's just walking away. When you have that
and
many
there's
people
your
leave.
problem is we are throwing to the wayside all of this experience. And, in New York, Mayor Adams, who was a police officer, although all my NYPD friends tell me he wasn't the best police officer. But he is saying, well, we'll just hire more, and we're going to see this as an opportunity to diversify the department. The problem is, and I assume our listeners know, that even if NYPD hired 2,000 cops tomorrow, it would be at least 1 year before they were a working patrol officer.
Well, and how many centuries worth of law enforcement experience is that's walking off the job that you're going to replace with 2 months of academy time? I mean, that's not going to happen.
Exactly. And who pays? It's the citizens of New York, and it's especially the citizens who cannot afford, that don't have the means to get out
of the city itself, not the means to get out of jail, but to leave the city and escape that particular environment.
Well, they get out of jail free, but they can't leave the city.
Yeah. Well, now, and this is also touching on news. Yesterday on the 5 on Fox News, Senator Tim Scott was sitting there and pointed out that major felonies in AOC's district had increased over 57% since New York's bail reform. And it's ironic, but probably not surprising, that the district is one of the leading defund the police voices and now swimming in additional crime.
Yeah, I believe crime in her district is up. I think I read 37%. But, AOC likes to talk about all those people committing crime are simply looking for a loaf of bread, trying to feed their families. And this is one of the those wrong facts that we hear a lot in the leftist media, is that people are committing crimes because they have no alternative, because they're poor, because this and that. You know what? There are millions and millions of poor people in this country who manage to get through life without committing a crime. Being a criminal is a conscious decision in most cases. And this is what we call the soft bigotry of low expectations. And you see this from the left a lot of the times, that, people can't help themselves. They're criminals because they're a person of color, or they are poor. And that is just a slap in the face to poor people of color, most who manage to get through their lives without becoming criminals and ever needing the bail bond system.
Well, I think it's also a misunderstanding on the part of most people. And I've said this in other places. Most people have a Facebook level of understanding of the criminal justice system and a traffic ticket level of experience with the police.
Yeah, but that's absolutely true.
Most people, when you talk about crime, they think solely of theft. Well, theft, so it must be economic. That's the only thing we have is crime. And you think, well, wait a second. Crimes against property make up just a small little piece of what actually constitutes crime. I mean, you have crimes against persons, sex offenses, all kinds of additional crimes that we classify as crimes that people don't really see those things. Domestic violence is a crime. A lot of crimes don't relate to simply theft or, the argument that people don't have a need. And it kind of skips me through some of my notes here, because I'll throw this into, let me skip down here a little bit, because I want to throw my little pop psychology session here, is because you brought up the issue of poverty and crime. And so there's definitely a correlation between crime and poverty, but which is not to say that poverty causes crime. And in all honesty, it's probably the other way around. Crime probably causes poverty. If you're predisposed to the type of behavior that we call crime, theft or violent tendencies, for instance, it can be really difficult to keep your job if you steal from your employer or you punch your boss while he's chewing you out for doing something wrong. And not being employed is the number one reason for poverty. Now, before the podcast last week, when I messed up our scheduling, we had discussed that we were both reading Criminal Injustice by Rafael Mangual. I'm probably butchering his last name. And yep, I have a copy of it here myself. Wasn't crazy about his suggestions about pretrial release, but he does hit a lot of high points here. In this point, he points out to two other and probably better explanations for criminal behavior that correlate far better than poverty. And these are illicit drug use and antisocial personality disorder. And it's more the antisocial personality disorder that I want to kind of focus on. He points out that antisocial personality has a prevalence in the general population of 2 to 4%, but has a prevalence among incarcerated men of 40 to 70% of all prisoners. Now, one thing you probably know, but most people probably don't, is there's been studies that show that only 6% of the total population is responsible for 50% of all crimes committed. Now, I can almost guarantee you that a large percentage of that 6% probably is that same to 2 to 4% of people with antisocial personality disorder. Now, to shorten this up, another characteristic of sociopaths, and that's someone who has antisocial personality disorder, I'll just call them sociopaths so I don't have to repeat that all the time, is how they view the lack of consequences or lack of negative reinforcement. And the criminal justice system is, at its core, when it's done properly, is really just a giant negative reinforcement loop. You do something wrong, we punish you for that, so you don't do something wrong like that in the future. And so other people who see that you're being punished for doing something wrong also say, hey, maybe I won't do that thing. That's the deterrent aspect of it. But sociopaths, and this is my own theory, so you'll feel free to pick it apart as we get a little further on, but sociopaths view a lack of negative enforcement or even just delayed consequences, they view that as positive reinforcement. This is the exact opposite of what we're trying to accomplish in the criminal justice system. And this to me is why bail reform is such a failure. It's trying to impose lesser consequences on a particular subset of the population that is wired to view lesser consequences as tacit approval to continue their antisocial behavior.
I just had this conversation with Dr. Phil on his television show yesterday. And Dr. Phil spends a lot of time, I don't think a lot of people know this, but he's a real big proponent of American law enforcement. But he also, as a clinical psychologist, he spends a lot of time in America's prisons he especially talks to death row inmates and extremely violent criminals. And he talked about exactly that. And he said that these people with, those sociopathic tendencies, he said most of the prison reform programs that are out there are doing nothing but feeding those sociopaths. And they're so pleased when they are able to get away with things, get things over on the system. And, this is something that most cops know. Sometimes the only way to stop a violent criminal in prison from reoffending is to age them. And, that is exactly what you need to do with somebody with those antisocial behaviors. As we know, most violent crimes are committed by young men. And when they go to prison and they, continue to get out without completing their sentences, they come out as still young men, still on a path of crime. Sometimes when you're able to put that 21-year-old, who does, multiple armed robberies and other violent crime, and he doesn't come out for 20, 25, 30 years, he may change his lifestyle, solely because A, he's older, and frankly, he has less testosterone, and B, all of his criminal gangbanging pals are either dead or in jail or have moved away, and he doesn't have that old neighborhood to go back to. So that is the sad reality of prison in this country, is sometimes the only way to deal with a very violent criminal is to age them in our prison system. And as Dr. Phil talked about yesterday, he meets a fair number of men who take advantage of some of those programs in prison, like education, like religious services, like mental health services. And he said that they sincerely want to be able to make a difference in their communities when they get out, but that they understand that what they did was terribly wrong and they need to pay a price for it. And that seems to be what we're missing in what we call criminal justice reform. There seems to be, we've stopped talking about people being punished. We've stopped talking about right or wrong. And frankly, we've stopped talking about the victim. We mostly talk about the offender and how we can make life easier for them. And it's leading us down this horrible path of increased crime in America.
No, I agree. And just the tail end of this is, the act of having to post bail. Basically, you have to call your friends or family and have them come down to the jail and spend money to bail you out. This is an immediate negative consequence. This is something that a lot of people don't want to do. I don't want to have to call my mom and say, I'm in jail again, come get me out. And it's also an opportunity for the family to have an intervention with the defendant, by either bailing them out with certain conditions. Okay, if I bond you out, you're going to go get a job. Or by not bailing them out at all. I have a number of people that I've had on bond before. They're back in custody for new charges or something else. And I call the family and go, hey, Junior's in custody. And they're like, yeah, Junior can just settle in. Because I told Junior last time, this is the last time. Maybe he'll learn something from this one. But when you take that family control away from the pretrial release program and just cycle them back out, when you just create this revolving door, you don't even have that speed bump to try and get them off the path of that criminal behavior. And so, when you create this revolving door, there's no immediate negative consequence. Unless you consider, a couple, 3 hours being booked to the jail a negative consequence. And if you've been there before, you generally don't. It's just, that's what we do. And if you fail to appear, and many of them do, you're looking in areas like Harris County. I think they reported, they were up 75% of people that released on their misdemeanor pre-bail program were failing to appear. Even long-term consequences, which these people don't necessarily respond to well for long-term consequences, but even those are being delayed even further. So, it's really no consequence to it. So we sort of got ahead of you. I was going to finish this off with you getting to pick apart my little theory there, but it sounds like you more or less agree with it. Okay, so your background in law enforcement, we'll get back on bail just a little bit more here. Your background in law enforcement is largely from what we in the bonding industry would call a no bond state, that is Illinois, which is not to say that there was no financial bail, but just no bail bondsman. Illinois was on the bleeding edge of the first iteration of bail reform back in the mid 60s and outlawed professional surety bail and all the practices associated with it. I believe that was 1964, and replaced surety bail with a 10% of the court scheme. And now creates problems for those of us that are still there because it's illegal for us to even go into Illinois and bring someone back. So, you hate to use the term redlining Illinois because that has racial connotations to it. But we have to be extra careful if we're going to post a bond for someone who is from Illinois and happens to get arrested in our area, because we are legally forbidden from picking those people up. If they're not felonies, or if we can't get assistance from law enforcement on picking up that felony, they can just escape to a state like Illinois and we can't get them back. But could you give us a little bit of a rundown sort of on how the Illinois D bond, which I believe is what the 10% bonds are called, how that worked prior to this latest iteration of bail reform, particularly in Cook County?
Well, yeah, our governor right now, Governor Pritzker, just signed into law. I think it takes effect next January. We're going to go to zero cash bail. But what we had in Illinois when I was a police officer there for 29 years was this notion of 10% cash bail. So if a judge or a particular offense, had a bail of $10,000, then the defendant could post 10% of that in cash. And then that would be their guarantee that they would come back to court. And as soon as they could post that bail, whether it was at the police department, that night when they got arrested, or it was the next day before a judge, when they were taken before a judge, they could post that bail. And that was their guarantee that they would come to court. And we had a few over the years, a few exceptions to that. For example, with domestic violence. I don't know if a lot of people know, but in the late 80s and into the early 90s, American law enforcement wasn't doing the best job in a lot of areas in dealing with domestic violence. And what was happening is when we would arrest an offender, most often a man, for physically beating up a family member, he could post that 10% bond in the state of Illinois and be immediately out to go right back home and reoffend. So there were some exceptions to that law, where even if they had that 10% to post after being arrested for domestic battery, for example, they would have to spend, I believe it was 72 hours in the county jail, and then they were able to give out. What that did was give a domestic violence victim some time to, whether it's get out of the home, get a restraining order, things like that. So I think that was a really good use of our bail and our 10% bond situation. But especially in Cook County, which is the next county up from where I worked, although I spent a lot of time working in Cook County. What's happening there with our very progressive state's attorney, we call him in Illinois, Kim Fox, who is oversees Cook County, Illinois, which is Chicago and some suburbs, she is letting virtually everyone out on what they call a personal recognizance bond, a PR. And that's just your signature that'll show up in court. And for some violent offenders, she'll slap an ankle bracelet on them. And again, they beat Chicago PD back to the neighborhood, and they go back to their gangbanging ways. And right now, I'm told from my friends at Chicago PD that they have a record number of people that they are arresting with ankle bracelets on them. Everyone is running around with an ankle bracelet on because they're out on a PR bond from Kim Fox's office. And so they are continuing to reoffend. And this takes on such a broad sweep, because in Chicago, as most people probably know, we have 40 to 70 shootings a weekend just in the city. And the few people that get arrested for those shootings are right back out to continue to reoffend. And yet, what do we hear from politicians and the media? We need more gun laws. We need more gun control. Unfortunately, in Illinois, like in most of the rest of the country, we're not using the gun laws that we already have on the books, and that's contributing to our rise in violent crime.
The 10% bonds, basically. So let's just, as an example, as a comparison to a traditional surety bond, essentially a $10,000 bond is functionally a $1,000 cash only bond, and you still were able to have that. And most people that get arrested, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't really understand is, well, if you've got the money, you can postpone. Well, yeah, but you don't. How many times did you arrest someone who had the full bond fee in their pocket? I mean, almost never. You always had to have some third party from the outside come in and try and get you bonded out. Now, that still involved an opportunity for an intervention or some sort of stopgap measure between you getting arrested and just walking right out the door. But it was different in that my assumption is that the Cook County or the state of Illinois never actually attempted to pursue collecting that other $9,000 when the person failed to appear on their 10% bond. Would that be accurate? I mean, I know that happens in most places. They make this big deal. Oh, we posted a $10,000 bond, and then the person didn't go to court and they kept their $1,000, but they never really made any sort of attempt to collect the other $9,000. And I know that the city of Philadelphia had a similar type of setup, and the Philadelphia is an Inquirer, I think is the main paper there, did a story several years ago that the city of Philadelphia or the counties there in Philadelphia were owed over $1 billion in unpaid bond forfeitures, which was the difference between that 10% deposit and the amount of bond that was posted. Okay, let's kind of get away from that and we'll talk more about police stuff here. Years ago, I picked up a book at Barnes & Noble when I was just flipping through there. My wife and I used to go pre-kids to the bookstore a lot. And the book was titled, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And the subtitle was, And It's All Small Stuff. I'm not a big fan of self-help books, but and I didn't really bother to read the whole book past the flap. And so I'm sure I took away the wrong message from the book. But what I interpreted that to be was, take care of the small things and the big things will take care of themselves. Or rather, the small things won't get out of hand and become big things. So that I probably more like actually sweating the small stuff than not sweating the small stuff. But about the same time that book came out, there was a philosophy emerging in law enforcement that police departments should very much sweat the small stuff. And this really emerged as the broken windows approach to police work. And can you kind of talk about what broken windows in law enforcement is, and if it works, and where does bail play a role in that particular law enforcement philosophy?
Well, that broken windows policing came out of the Manhattan Institute, which is still one of the leaders in research on criminal justice and other issues in this country. And the broken windows theory of policing is literally, if you have a building with 4 or 5 broken windows and next to it is a vacant lot with a bunch of trash in it and all that, and you just ignore that and you let it go, that will ultimately become a gathering place for people. And then it will eventually become a place where there's going to be drug dealing, and then a place where people don't feel safe. And so basically what broken windows policing is, take care of things like fare jumpers on the subway, broken down cars in parking lots, trashed front yards in apartment complexes and rental homes. And I could go on and on and on. And what that does is show that the people and the police and the government, whether it's city or county government, all those entities care about what's happening in this community, and that they are paying attention to what's happening in this community. And you know what, criminals, maybe you ought to take your crime elsewhere. And especially when we look at, for example, fare jumpers in cities, and this is most large cities, where people rely on public transportation. There was data years ago out of New York City that said probably 1 out of every 4 to 7 fare jumpers on the New York subway had some sort of weapon on them, or they had a warrant for their arrest, or other bigger crimes than they jumped the fare. Now, what we're seeing now in the last 2 years with criminal justice reform is people are saying, stop making traffic stops for low-level offenses like no sticker on your license plate, like something dangling from the rearview mirror, broken taillight, things like that. Stop bothering people for these low-level offenses because it's racist and it is attacking people who don't have the means to take care of these little things. And where this comes into when we talk about bail reform, again, this truly is just another cog in the lack of protection that we are providing for our citizens. All of these, what you would perceive to be small things, when you begin to knit them all together, stop pulling people over or addressing small crimes, to, stop making people post any kind of money to get out of jail, to stop arresting people for misdemeanors and focus on felonies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you end up what we are experiencing right now, which is a huge jump in crime in most of the left-leaning cities in this nation, frankly, most large cities with a few exceptions. And now it's bleeding out to the suburbs, it's bleeding out into the rural areas. And then to wrap that all up, we have this massive exodus of law enforcement officers throughout the country, so that now there are a lot of American citizens who are going to have to protect themselves from criminals. At the same time, we're hearing more about gun control, and the Second Amendment is under attack. And we are spiraling toward disaster in this country when it comes to crime and the justice system.
Well, and I think that a lot of people will make this argument, why aren't you, and this is, somebody gets pulled over for a traffic ticket and they're like, well, shouldn't you be out trying to catch murderers? And, obviously that's an overreaction, but still, people don't seem to understand that most people that are charged with serious criminal offenses, they didn't just start there. They worked their way up to committing those criminal offenses. They worked their way up from shoplifting to stealing cars. They worked their way up from misdemeanor assault to armed robbery. You generally don't start off, the very first crime you ever committed is a murder. Now, not to say that there aren't some of those. I mean, domestic disputes sometimes fall into those sorts of categories. But as a general rule, you don't just start off being in the midst of just start off criminal, doing the most worst thing you could possibly think of. So when police are then tasked with ignoring all these little things, are we not just basically training in the criminal element and how to make it easier to commit these smaller crimes that then make it to where they start committing larger crimes down the road?
Well, yeah, what it leads to is just an absolute lack of accountability on anyone's part. And for example, I always tell people this. People say, well, why can't you just mail someone a ticket because they don't have a sticker on their license plate? Why do you have to pull them over? That's great until you're the person who is T-boned at an intersection where that person doesn't have valid registration. So generally speaking, that invalid registration renders their insurance invalid. So now you've just been hit by an uninsured motorist, and maybe that motorist hasn't bothered to renew their driver's license or get one in the first place, because why should they? Because there's no punishment, there's no accountability for it. And that begins to affect everyone. And I think, again, a lot of well-meaning people in this country are starting to realize that that's exactly what's happening. I mean, we can look at corporate America, a lot of retail businesses, chain retail businesses, who were all posting black squares on their Instagram and sending big checks to the Marxist organization known as Black Lives Matter. Now, those very same corporations are finding out in their individual stores that in a lot of these progressive counties, people are coming in and they are able to steal $500, $750, $1,000 worth of merchandise with absolutely no consequences whatsoever. And that's affecting these corporations, their bottom line. It's also affecting the people who live in those neighborhoods, because those shops are going to close. And now people have nowhere to get their shampoo and their prescription drugs and their gallon of milk for their child.
Right, your food and retail deserts, that those are being created by crime, running those businesses out of those areas. And I mentioned the five, where Senator Scott earlier in the podcast, but one of the things they followed up on that afterwards was that you were beginning to see a movement, or there was a backlash coming. And I've pointed this out before, that with more and more victims of crime, either direct victims or using the example you just gave of people showing up in stores and emptying garbage bags, from the shelves full of items and leaving the store. I mean, whether or not that happened to you as a store, we see those things on television. We feel victimized by that. But there's going to be a backlash for this. I mean, you're going to have the general population at some point is going to say enough, and there's going to be this draconian backlash. Now, my concern about this is, from a bail perspective, is that you're not going to just say, oh, well, the old system was working great or was working good enough, so let's just go back to this old system of secured release. You're going to have a complete pendulum swing to the other side and say, hey, we need to preventively detain all these people. Everybody who gets arrested should be preventively detained. And we've seen that happen in the federal system, where you went from prior to the Crime Act of 84 or whatever the bail reform was it 84? Yeah, 84, where 23% of people were incarcerated. Now you have 75% of people incarcerated. We're seeing the January 6th defendants, whether, no, I'm not supporting that, their actions or anything like that. They should pay the price for whatever it is that they did. But you have people who've been preventively detained for a year and a half over what are basically trespassing charges. So are we going to move to that direction in response to this increase in crime? Or are we going to try and find some balance in the middle? So I guess, what are your thoughts from a police perspective on the use of pretrial preventive detention?
Well, in the case of January 6th, the vast majority of those defendants that are being held without bail, that's a political situation, and it's abhorrent in this nation. You have people around this country who have literally committed murder, who are out, and 65-year-old cancer victim who committed trespass on the steps of the Capitol is in jail, and they have been in jail for 18 months. So that's one of the problems with the system that we're seeing now, is that it can be politicized in both directions. We have people that should not be held, people that aren't flight risks, and then we have people that are not only flight risks, but they are criminal re-offending risks that are being let out. And again, this is all part of what is known as procedural justice, where the court or a piece of the system looks at things that Lady Justice, who is blindfolded, is not supposed to look at, whether it's race, where they were raised, how they were raised, things like that. Procedural justice says that a person's experience with the justice system needs to be based on things like race, gender ideology, politics, in the case of January 6th, all the things that the American justice system, that the American Constitution says should not happen. And bail reform, again, is swirling around in that horrible vortex of procedural justice, or some people call it restorative justice. And it's doing nothing but making America less safe.
Okay, well, let's talk about less safe just a little bit here. Following the death of Michael Brown and the Ferguson riots, I personally saw a real shift in policing on the Missouri side. So if you're not aware, I'm in the Kansas City area. And so I'm on the Kansas side, but obviously a lot of my clients live in Missouri. And it's one of the reasons they have to postpone it, because they're out-of-state residents. And as bondsmen, we are also the beneficiaries, along with society as general, of proactive policing. Police who make more stops, engage the community more often, are more likely to come across our fugitives. So we get the benefit of that. But following the riots, I definitely noticed both an increase in my failures to appear, particularly people who lived in Missouri were saying, I'm not going to court. This whole system is bogus and racist, and so I don't have to go to court for this. And I also noticed a drop in the number of fugitives who were just being randomly arrested by the police. So, means that I had to go do my job more aggressively. I had to go get those people back in. But you could still see that there was a response to that. And that's just my own anecdotal experience from here. But the Eric Holder Justice Department attempted to use these riots as a justification of their anti-bail Dear Colleague letters, encouraging lawsuits against various court systems, like Ferguson, where they did sue Ferguson, to do away with any sort of secured bail. Now, this seems to be basically the exact opposite of the broken windows version of policing that we talked about earlier. But from the police perspective, what is the Ferguson effect? Is it real? And how does it impact public safety?
Well, the Ferguson effect is absolutely real, and it was a slow march toward what we call depolicing, where police officers are saying, you know what, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to go to prison for doing my job. I don't want to be fired for doing everything right. I mean, looking at the Michael Brown shooting, Michael Brown was a strong arm robber. He was a gangbanger. He was a felon who tried to disarm a police officer and was shot and killed. And 3 different investigations showed that the officer that killed Michael Brown was 100% justified. And one of those investigations was done by the Eric Holder Department of Justice. And yet Michael Brown is still a Black Lives Matter martyr, and the hands up, don't shoot that never occurred is still a rallying cry when we talk about criminal justice reform. So police officers saw that, and then they started to say, you know what, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm not going to be as aggressive in some of the things that I'm doing. And this went on until about 2017, 2018, when we had a much more pro-law enforcement atmosphere in this country, pro-law enforcement presidential administration, and frankly, we had a real low crime rate. And then the death of George Floyd occurred, and some other infamous cases, including Breonna Taylor. And again, people were told, everything. One of the things I want people to know is virtually everything you've been told in the media about the Breonna Taylor case is a lie. It's just a lie. And yet most people don't really know the facts. But so we go, post May of 2020, and American law enforcement saw what happened in Minneapolis. They saw the 3rd precinct burned down. They saw what happened in the Breonna Taylor case, in the Rayshard Brooks case in Atlanta. We're still waiting for a disposition on that. And American law enforcement said, you know what? I'm not going to go to prison for doing my job. So this atmosphere of depolicing stopped being slow marched, and it just moved forward on steroids. And that's why we have this rise in crime in the last 2 years that a lot of people want to blame on things like the pandemic. It's just absolutely not true. And who's suffering for it? It's largely Black and brown people who are the majority of these additional homicide victims. In St. Louis is a perfect example. Who are the majority of the homicide victims in St. Louis? Primarily Black people. In New York City, 95% of the homicide victims are Black and brown people. So everybody got hysterical about the death of George Floyd. And what have we done? We have created an atmosphere where thousands of Black men have been murdered in a misguided attempt to change our justice system and avenge the death of George Floyd. And the way that, again, the bail system fits into that is that people who are committing violent crimes in very many of these progressive areas are getting out without posting a dime of money. They may or may not have an ankle bracelet, and they are free to re-offend and continue their life of violent crime because they know there are almost no consequences to what they're doing.
Well, and a couple of points there. I think on the murder deal, Heather McDonald, I think in her book War on Cops, really did do some breakdown numbers on that in New York City alone, the more aggressive, proactive policing that they engaged in likely saved, I think her figure was at least 10,000 lives of largely, Black and Latino young men who would not be alive today had the police not been doing the job that they were doing at that point in time in preventing these types of crimes from occurring. So it really does seem to be sort of an unrelenting decade for police, with maybe a brief, respite in there until it was election time. So it was time to have some more riots. From Ferguson to George Floyd to defund the police, people point out that, we're just trying to make bail more fair. Well, that all went away when the same people pushing for more fair bail saw the chance to defund the police. When the George Floyd situation came along and that was an error to get rid of the police. These people really wanted to get rid of the police. They wanted to get rid of the entire criminal justice system. They were just working on bail because they saw that as low-hanging fruit, because most people don't understand it and most people don't have any sort of experience with it. But this really is an attack on the criminal justice system writ large. But when you do talk to people about this or listen to what people say, they really do want to get rid of the criminal justice system. So, all right. So one of the offshoots of the defund the police movement has been an argument that mental health workers can replace law enforcement officers when dealing with defendants with mental health issues. And I've got my own little story about that I can kind of touch on, but I'm curious about what your thoughts from the police perspective are as far as let's put social workers in the field, maybe side by side with cops, or maybe responding on their own to mental health situations.
I've been a police officer since 1980. And when I got hired, we already had police social workers on our police department. The state of Illinois was really big in that arena. And I would love to see a social worker with every single patrol officer in this country. The problem is no one wants to pay for it. A social worker is someone with a minimum of a master's degree and some initial training in either clinical psychology, things like that. You're not going to pay those people a cop salary, especially if all they can do is deal with mental health issues. So we can talk about, I would love to see every police department have a social worker that is readily available 24/7, 365 to respond to the scene of every mental health crisis there is. But I'm guarantee you the American public doesn't understand it, and they certainly don't want to pay for it. And that's one of the things when we talk about American law enforcement, everybody wants us to fix every single societal ill that's out there, whether it's dealing with animal cruelty, delivering a baby, making sure that I get an accident report when some uninsured motorist has crashed into my car, to dealing with my mentally ill son, daughter, uncle, next door neighbor, whatever it is, and doing it absolutely perfectly and making sure absolutely no one gets hurt. That'd be great if it could happen, but it's a fantasy.
Well, and part of the problem with that particular argument, and I'll get into my story here in a minute, but is that if the police are being called, it's not because the person that they're being called about needs a quick therapy session. They more than likely are engaged in some sort of violent behavior, and they need to be incapacitated. And then you can get them into a therapy session or start looking at getting into the appropriate counseling once that situation has been resolved. Once that, they've been taken out of that violent situation. And the story that I have is we had a kid on bond, and this is when they first started doing some mental health, they wanted mental health ride-alongs in my county. And so in the city we were in, this woman calls us and says, I bought out my son, but he's here throwing knives at me. I need you to come pick him up. It's like, one, I'm not the police. Two, I don't think I even have the paperwork in order to effect that pickup. I need a certified copy of the bond. I can't just respond immediately and do those things. Call the police. And so they call the police, the local police, and they go, well, that's a mental health issue. We can't do anything. It's like, he's throwing knives at his mother. That's not simply a mental health issue. And as it turns out, we had to basically call our local county jail, have them look up the fact that we posted the bond before, and I had to send my people in to pick this kid up and take him to jail and surrender him to get him out of the house, because the police are like, well, it's a mental health situation, there's nothing to do. That's a crime. It's an aggravated assault in our particular statutory language to throw a knife at somebody. So I think there's a misunderstanding or a misexpectation of what people think that's going to do. I'm all for getting people the mental health counseling they need, but that can't be done on the curb. That's got to be something where the police are able to incapacitate that person and then get them into some sort of reasonable therapy session. Bail bondsmen, we'll kind of wrap this up towards the end. Bail bondsmen and police often face the same types of racial allegations. I'd like to go through a few of these claims and just kind of get a quick response from you on how the police counter these arguments. Maybe some of bail bondsmen can learn from this. First of all, there's the notion that, bail bondsmen make their decision based on race and cops are all racist. So how do we respond to that particular claim? Because it's ubiquitous.
Well, here's the thing. First of all, police use force in less than 1% of everyone we arrest. We end up shooting and killing about 1,000 people a year, and somewhere around a third of those are African American, and depending on the year, somewhere between 4 and 20 of those are quote unquote unarmed. So and yet if you talk to most people in this country, they would tell you that American law enforcement shoots thousands, if not tens of thousands of people fatally each year, and most of them are Black. So we have this, when you want to talk about who's a racist, it's not American law enforcement, it's the media, it's the public, it's the activists. Because what we hear all the time is that, oh, the justice system is racist, bail system is racist, prison is racist. To say that makes the presumption that most people in the criminal justice system are people of color. Again, it's that soft bigotry of low expectations. So American law enforcement keeps being told that we need to do more community policing programs. We need to do more outreach. We need to do things to get into communities of color. We need to have more police officers who are people of color. Those things are not our choices. Those are things that happen and we react to them. The American justice system is race neutral, and it needs to stay that way. And again, American law enforcement is not going to be the panacea for all of society's ills. People talk a lot about race, but they don't talk a lot about facts. George Soros just did a op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. George Soros is the man largely responsible for installing with campaign money all these progressive prosecutors around the country. And one of the things he said, he doubled down and said, I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep supporting progressive prosecutors. And part of it is because Black people are 5 times as likely to go to jail. Now, does that mean that American law enforcement hunts down African Americans and takes them to jail for doing nothing wrong? No, we know what the stats are as far as who is committing crime. And there's a reason that Lady Justice wears a blindfold. Crime's not an evenly distributed problem in this country. It's not equitable. It's never going to be equitable. People don't even understand what that word means. Equitable does not mean equal. Our justice system is to treat people equally, not equitably. Not everyone gets an equitable outcome in life, but we are all to be treated equally. So this nonsense that our justice system is racist is just a lie, but it's a lie that's been told over and over and over and over again in the media and by politicians and by activists until people start to believe it.
Well, and when I was testifying before the Kansas Pretrial Justice Task Force, the Chief Justice of the Kansas Court of Appeals was chairing that, and she basically said, I agree that there's implicit bias in courts and law enforcement. It's like, man, you're supposed to be the one pushing back against that narrative. Are you telling me that as a sitting court judge, you're making your decisions based upon race? Well, no, of course not. But then if you're not making your decisions based on race, if you're making your decisions based on fact, then your argument is, well, I don't know what your argument is. It gets to be, quite complex. Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. So let me get you to tell us all about yourself just a little bit more. People that want to look up you and follow where you are. I know you've got a website, you've got a Twitter handle, and some other stuff going on. If you could give us all that information to where we can follow you and see what's going on with you?
So I want folks to go to nationalpolice.org and see all the terrific things that the National Police Association is doing, not just for American law enforcement, but for the citizens who support us. We're not a police union. We're not an association that you can join. But what we do is we bring attention to the anti-police efforts that are challenging effective law enforcement in this country. And we do it through mailings. We do it through national television appearances by me. You can see me on Newsmax and Fox News and OAN and many other news sources, podcasts like this. We have a show on Pluto and on cable, and it streams on the 1st, and it's on our YouTube page called the NPA Report, where I interview various police leaders and spouses and anybody involved or trying to inform folks about the law enforcement profession. We have a team of attorneys that get involved in various cases that have far-reaching effects, whether it's for law enforcement or the citizens we are trying to protect. We have a team of writers who put out some terrific content on our Facebook and our Twitter page and on our website, again, at nationalpolice.org. If you want more information about me, you can go to femaleforces.com or bucksavage.com, learn about our training. And if you are not faint of heart, follow me on Twitter at SGT Betsy Smith. I dabble in law enforcement issues, a little bit in politics, and occasionally a cute picture of my 3 dogs. And I appreciate you having me on this podcast and all that you guys do to bring attention to bail and bond and what this all means for the criminal justice system.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today, Betsy. I did log on and follow you on Twitter, so I'll be following the entertainment that you provide there and the information you provide as well. But thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on the Bail in the Midwest podcast.